You're listening to Sweet Bytes with Sandra with your host, Sandra Colton-Medici. Tune in every Thursday to satisfy your entrepreneurial sweet tooth. Follow on Instagram at Sweet Bytes with Sandra and Sandra Colton-Medici. You can also join our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/Sweet Bytes with Sandra. Hi, I'm Sandra, and I'd like to invite you to subscribe and listen to my new podcast, Sweet Bytes with Sandra. Satisfy your entrepreneurial sweet tooth in each episode, full of digital business tips, inspiring interviews, asides from my entertainment career, and rewards to celebrate your sweet success. Find Sweet Bytes with Sandra on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Welcome back to Sweet Bytes with Sandra. I'm so excited to be joined by my friend and such an esteemed gentleman coming to us from the lovely state of Hawaii, Mr. Colonel James Minnich. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, I'm so glad that you invited me. This is going to be so much fun.
I know, because we go, 3 years back?
At least that far back.
At least. And your career is so long and amazing. And I wanted to have you on just to ask you some questions, because there are a lot of people who may or may not have been in the military, but there are so many intricacies and details and career strategies that I feel like people could benefit from listening to your story. So if you don't mind, just kind of starting at the beginning, if you will, of your, maybe how you decided that, enlisting into the military was something that was right for you, or maybe not, it just happened. I'm not quite sure. What is your story there?
When I grew up, and I grew up in a home of modest means. We weren't poor, but we didn't have extra. And I came from a long family line of fathers, brothers, grandfathers, uncles who'd all served in the military all the way for, at least back to the Civil War. Mm-hmm. I knew this. And I also knew that if I was, when I finished high school, I needed to get out on my own. And so my father had talked to me about joining the military. He and his father and his uncles had all been in the Navy, and I kind of thought I might go in that direction. Mm-hmm. But I was, and while I started in that path, even with Navy Junior ROTC in the 70s, I was doing that. I eventually found myself in the doors of the Army recruiters, and was excited for the things that they spoke to me about. And I had begun a path, even in high school, to go that direction. Mm-hmm. I enlisted in the fall of 1981, and then went to basic training in the summer of 1982. And that began for me what was a 37-year career in the military. Now, it's a long career. Mm-hmm. Those who serve a career typically go 20 years. Usually at the length, 30 years. I had the opportunity to go longer because I served first number of years as an enlisted soldier before I was commissioned an officer. I did retire as a Army colonel who had served at least 7 years, I guess, as an Army colonel. But when I think back to when this all began, the feelings I had, right? I mean, I felt connected. I felt connected to a family line who had done this. But I quickly felt connected to teams, the teams that I joined, that I would, I served in many teams, small and large over the years, but there was this sense of connection. But I was excited too. Mm-hmm. I mean, this was new. I was going into, a world which seemed so much broader than the one I had been in. And I'd actually, for a boy growing up in the 60s and the 70s, I actually was in a lot of groups or areas of the country, I would say, that most people might not have been in. I had traveled all around the country. I went to 14 schools growing up, Sandra. I mean, my father moved us all the time. This was going to schools, 2 or 3 different grades, schools of grade. And it was, fortunately, I guess I was pretty quick on education, but I felt like I had gaps. But notwithstanding, I was excited. I had volunteered. I was going to go to Korea, and off I went. Did those things. I saw opportunities. I knew I wanted education, but there was no means at home to do this, and the Army had offered, and in fact, it's how I continued to progress, was those opportunities of education. I mean, I began with earning, going to school at nighttime with tuition assistance, earning a bachelor's degree. I became an officer. I went on and was able to pursue 2 master's degrees. We did a doctorate at USC, and all of these things were funded through the military, through different. Some of them were benefits, others were paid opportunities, but it was exciting for me. And bringing it to an end was difficult.
Yeah. You mentioned USC, you mentioned master's degree. You forgot Harvard somewhere in there.
I did a master's at Harvard. You know, that reminds me. When I think about what somebody wants to do, they want to be, you know, their career, and what choices they may make, I often think, don't close your own doors. We tend to do that a lot, right? We're like, oh, I couldn't do that. That's well beyond what I might be able to do. And so we just close our own doors. Right. Maybe even worse yet, we just lay our ladders on the ground. We don't even try. And so I pursued differently. You know, you mentioned Harvard. And when I had started to pursue many years into service. Now, this is the late 90s, and I came in, as I told you, early 80s. I wanted to be a foreign area officer, and a colleague of mine, and part of being a foreign area officer is language training, it's regional training, and it is advanced civil schooling. It is getting a master's degree. And a colleague of mine had applied for Harvard University, and I hadn't even considered, and he had been accepted. And I thought to myself, because I was in the applying stage, I said, won't know unless I apply. And so I did. And I will tell you that getting selected was the first step. The second step was having them pay for most of it, because the Army, it was a high cost school. The Army was only going to pay for a very small portion. And they actually did. They paid a significant portion of that 2-year education there in Cambridge. It was wonderful. But thanks for asking.
Yeah, well, I can't skip over that, because it's such a high level achievement beyond obviously your career in the Army and the military. 37 years is amazing. Just consistency wise, that, you know, a lot of people, you know, hop from one thing to the next, and you know, for a long time I feel like there were jobs where you would want to stay for a long time, and I feel like you know, those kinds of positions aren't really around anymore. You know, the ones that have pensions, and you know, I feel like those just don't exist for a lot of young people these days. And so when you talk about, you know, the families that are formed and the teams that you build and are working with, you know, what are some of the lessons that you feel like you've learned, you know, throughout your career? I know you could talk about so much, but so just maybe some things that stand out in your mind that are things that you learned in your career, as far as lessons that were like, that right there, like I needed to have that moment in order to get to the next place.
You know, I've had a number of those moments, and it's interesting. I was just even recently talking, I've got adult children, one son who's 34, the other one who's 36. And so I'll give you a perspective. And the thing that you just told me, Sandra, is exactly what he had mentioned to me, is that the opportunities are not the same for my generation as they are in his. Mm-hmm. Now, I think that's largely true. I do know that the federal government still has many of these pension programs that are in the armed services, but also in its civil servants. And so that aside, I guess I would mention that I have benefited by others who have gone before me, and I've listened to them as they have told me of things that they have done. And I have thought, I hadn't even considered it. But because I listened, yeah. I then thought I could do this. Mm-hmm. And this starts early. I'd mentioned I went to Officer Candidate School, OCS, and I did that in 1990, but in the later 80s, I had applied to be a warrant officer, a technical type of officer. And I thought for sure I was going to be accepted. And so did others.
Yeah.
And yet it came back rejected. Now I could have been discouraged and said, this is where I'm at. I'm at this level. This is what I had a friend of mine who had applied for Officer Candidate School, and he knew I was seeking to continue to advance. And I think we all ought to, in degrees, work toward potentials. And because he had told me about that, I then went down that path. I told you I had another colleague who had applied for Harvard, and because he did that, I said, I can do that.
Right.
I had a colleague who had, who was a graduate of the USC program and said, let me tell you. And as a result of that, I was quite interested. And I said, I think I'd like to pursue that path.
Yeah.
Constantly, I have been the beneficiary of somebody who had been before me, somebody who had shown me the path, and that mattered. And so I think that is at least one lesson I would take from a long career.
A long career, but I have to talk about you being a Korean linguist. Now, I didn't know this when we were in our doctorate program together, and I feel like it's enlightening to know just those little tidbits about people that just you find out later, that you don't boast, you don't brag, you don't say I'm doing that for you, because you don't do it. But I feel like there's something about going after, seeking, for you, it was definitely beneficial for your career to have that added skill, right? So what is something when you're thinking about, the inspiration for taking up, another language, to have that added, thing on your resume? What is that, what inspired you to do that? And where do you think some of the tools that people need these days, that they should be adding to their resume?
Thank you for that. I had mentioned that I was a foreign area officer, and there are several aspects to being a foreign area officer, where you would do military policy in different regions of the world. And so as a result of choosing that path, and I chose that path because I was interested. I had served many years overseas. I enjoyed the engagement with foreign militaries. And I knew that there were prospects for studying a language and for obtaining a master's degree and continuing service overseas. I actually have 19 years of service overseas assignments. And so that's quite a significant amount of years in the military. But, and I told you on my first assignment, I had chose to go to Korea. My father had served in the Navy in the late 50s in Japan, and I was excited to go to that part of the region. The world seemed much smaller, much larger back then, and I hadn't traveled on an airplane until anyhow. So I was excited for this. Korean language is difficult. For English speakers, we categorize the different languages of the world, and for English speakers, it's in a category 4, which is in a category 1 through 4. It's the highest category, so it's tough. Which means it actually took real effort, real schooling and focusing on that. Now, I had tested at the top of my levels, on the top of the levels of those at different times, so I did well, but not because it wasn't without effort. And I think I learned this I learned a lot of things, I guess, but one thing I had to get over, and that was, I knew I would not be as articulate learning and speaking Korean as I was perhaps in English. And so that could be a bit of an inhibitor. We can feel prideful, and we don't want to feel vulnerable at all. And so rather than speaking at all, well, we won't say anything. But that delimits our opportunities if we shut ourselves down. And so that certainly applied in learning Korean and working in a lot of different jobs that I did. I was a foreign area officer for 20 years, a tactical field artillery officer the 17 years before that. But I think that same type of lesson is applicable beyond just learning a language, right? As an officer, I constantly was moving into jobs where I would lead organizations and didn't necessarily have direct expertise in those areas. And so I would often, I made it a practice to talk with people, to talk with people in the organization about how do you do this, and show me this, and have them introduce me to these things. And people are always fascinated to tell you about what they do.
Yeah.
I was learning at the same time. Certainly didn't put off any air of hubris that, I'm in charge, none of that. That's not the way I would lead anyhow. And I credit that to a lot of good mentors I've had over the years that I've tried to emulate. But I have found that if you extend yourself and reach out and are not delimited by feelings of being embarrassed or prideful, you can achieve a lot.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned mentors. Who's one of your mentors, and how did that relationship form?
I think my deepest, my strongest mentor is Colonel Mike McKeeman. He retired a number of years ago. I first worked for him as a young officer. He was my boss. He certainly gave me jobs. I would say he took me under his wing, but I don't know that it was any more so than any other officer he did. But then I worked for him later on as well for a number of years. To give you a degree of, we've kept in contact, but he flew all the way out here to Hawaii for my retirement. Yeah. So that was a big deal. So that degree of mentorship that went over, nearly 30 years but he was a caring leader. He really was. He pursued excellence. And I learned from watching him how to be that type of a leader who genuinely cared about others. And as a result, I think it has made me more approachable. I feel like, I'm friendly. I feel like it has become more and more of who I am, to be that type of a person. I try to, continue to emulate those characteristics, but that who I've become in my teachings as a professor. But I would say that leadership really is probably boiled down to character and competence, and character matters immensely. But people will also trust you if you are competent in what you do. And so those things have been important. I've certainly learned from a lot of mentors over the years. Learned a number of things, but Mike McKeeman, Colonel Mike McKeeman, is prominent in my ladder of mentors.
Awesome. So let's talk about your most recent degree, the Doctor of Education from University of Southern California in Organizational Change and Leadership, where you studied. I want you to just introduce it because you talk about it so it's effortless when it comes out of you versus me. So what was the title of your dissertation?
So thank you for asking that. It's really a passion of mine. Societal violence against women and national insecurity. I looked at evaluation study on teaching a gendered security perspective. That's a mouthful, right? I mean, it really is. But what does it all mean? I look at this as an approach or a methodology that does really three things. It strengthens the solutions to state and human security issues. So, big state security issues, sovereignty and these things, human security issues that deal with real plights of people. And I see this as it strengthens both of those. I see that it frames the individual as the security focus. We often see and focus the state and state interests and sovereignty issues, and we forget for whom we're providing security. I've seen this through nearly 4 decades of service. And it accounts for those gender-based needs and interests in all security situations. And so that is, when I talk about gendered security, that's what I'm talking about. And so at the institution where I work, the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, we have security studies professors who teach security practitioners that come throughout the Indo-Pacific region. These are mid and senior career person who come to the center for several weeks to learn and be better security practitioners. And my hypothesis is really that if security practitioners understood and applied the principles of gendered security in their craft as they provided for the peace and security in what they're charged with, we would end up with a much better security than what we have. And as I have seen over all these years, I've thought that we would have done so much better in advancing security in these different countries, whether it was Iraq or Afghanistan or Vietnam or the small ones in between, or had we thought about who we were providing security for, that we saw people as the priority. I'll tell you that I have found that security practitioners often see them as a problem. They're in the way. And we forget that these are for whom we're providing security for. And so that's what this approach looks at. And so I wanted to know, if we believe that it's important to teach, why is it that we're not actually teaching it very well? And so I looked at that and understood the knowledge issues and motivational issues and organizational issues, and thought if we approach this now differently, we might do better. When I retired, I stayed at the same institution. I was associate dean there before I retired. But after retiring, I became a professor, and I took on the chair of two groups. One of them Northeast Asia, and then this one on women, peace, and security. And so I started implementing these things that I had researched and found out that about through this, and realized we could do this so much better. Now, I could certainly talk about issues of gender security. I did recently, in a recent publication, wrote a book chapter on this title, on this issue: societal violence against women, a need for gendered security. And so where I lay all this out. So that's how much I've really driven by this, is continue to pursue it even after the degree.
Which is great, because there's so many people who kind of say, okay, here it is and it's done, and to the side. It's great to see that the results of your work actually matter in a way that's tangible for people to kind of say, okay, well, now how do I get my hands on this new, I guess it may or may not be new. It's just a revelation of what has been happening to what the security studies have been before, and now how you're trying to implement how to make them better, with how you're presenting the material, or using your professorship to, have lectures about them, or even the book chapter to, spread the word, and get it far and wide. I know that you are going to stick with us. There's so much more. So if you are listening to the podcast and you are ready for some fun tidbits, make sure you hop over to Extra Byte for a little bit more with Colonel James Minnich. And we thank you so much for joining me today on Sweet Bytes with Sandra. I so appreciate you.
Oh, you take care.
Tune in every Thursday to satisfy your entrepreneurial sweet tooth with me, Sandra Colton Medici, on Sweet Bytes with Sandra.